Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to American Cultural Encounters with East Asia during the Cold War, an online professional development webinar sponsored by America in Class and Primary Source. My name is Richard Schramm. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs at the National Humanities Center, and I'll be moderating this evening's session. Before we get underway, let me warn you, we've got a lot of territory to cover tonight, so we may go over a little bit. Our normal ending time is 8:30. We may go beyond that, but please bear with us because we really have some interesting material to share with you tonight. Before we get underway, let me briefly introduce to you the co-sponsors of this evening's webinar. America in Class is sponsored by the National Humanities Center, which is the country's only independent institute for advanced study in all branches of the humanities. Located in Research Triangle Park, we run a fellowship program that brings scholars to the center for an academic year to do research and writing in subjects like history, literature and language studies, philosophy, criticism of the arts, that sort of thing. We have maintained a vigorous outreach program to teachers. You have found our webinars. You can find all the other materials and resources we offer for teaching American history and literature at americainclass.org. That will land you on this page, and from here you can gain access to everything the Humanities Center does for teachers. Primary Source has, for the past 27 years, provided teachers with a wide array of resources on global learning. They offer face-to-face seminars, workshops, online courses, and free webinars. Our focus at the Humanities Center is on American history and literature. Primary Source expands that view and looks all over the world, and they deal with U.S. history and literature and U.S. concerns in an international context. It's a wonderful resource. You can find everything they offer at www.primarysource.org. And when you go to Primary Source, website, and /cultural power, you can find a rich array of resources that Primary Source offers for a wide range of international and global topics. Please check out their resources. I know this is an excellent resource. We have used it at the Humanities Center to link to some of our material, and I think that you will find the material that Primary Source offers really, really useful and worthwhile. So please check them out. In the meantime, we have some lessons that are germane for this evening. In our webinar this evening, you will hear about NSC 48, which was a National Security Council report that covered our Cold War relationship with Asia. If you go to our lesson, NSC 68, America's Cold War Blueprint, that will give you some context for what we're going to hear tonight, because that was the National Security Council report that really established the overarching strategy of the United States during the Cold War. And you're also going to be hearing this evening about how Asian Americans have been conceived in American popular culture. You might want to look at the Chinese question from a Chinese standpoint to see how Asian Americans were constructed in the late 19th century. So we have two lessons there, americainclass.org/lessons. I think those are particularly germane. Check those out along with all of the other lessons that we offer there. Check out our Pinterest page. Like Primary Source, we offer a wide array of materials. We gather up a whole bunch of things, not only from our own resources, but from others, and we offer them to you in our Pinterest page. You can keep abreast of what the Humanities Center does for teachers on Facebook, and we have something new, and I hope some of you have seen this. We have introduced a new monthly newsletter that will provide you with updates about our lessons and our webinars and news from the center itself. At the end of our program, please go to the website for this webinar. There you will find a recording, the PowerPoint presentation. Please feel free to use material from the presentation in your classes. That's what it's there for. You'll also find an evaluation. If you'll fill that out and send it back to us, at that point you'll be able to download a certificate of participation that you'll be able to submit to your local certifying authority to obtain whatever recertification credit your participation in this webinar warrants. How do you participate? Well, our seminar leader, Christina Klein, will be lecturing this evening, and we'll be having a conversation, Christina and I will, and we'll be stopping from time to time to pose discussion questions. We hope you'll respond to those by putting your cursor in that little box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, that elongated narrow box. Type your response, hit that send button to the right. It will appear in the chat above, and I will be bringing that into the conversation at appropriate moments during the evening. Now, don't wait for us to ask a question. If you have a comment, if you have a question to make during the program, please feel free to do that. The cardinal rule of our programs is the more you participate, the better the webinar. So let's get underway. We're very pleased this evening to have with us Christina Klein, an associate professor of English and the director of the master's program at Boston College. In 2003, she brought out Cold War Orientalism, Asia in the Middle Brow Imagination, 1945 to 1961. So let me turn Tina's microphone on and turn the program over to her. Christina, it's all yours.
Hi. Thank you very much. It's really a privilege to be speaking to such a big group of high school teachers. And thank you for inviting me. My 11th grade teacher, high school U.S. history teacher, really changed my life. I wrote a paper on Truman in the Cold War, and I find myself 30 years later still chewing on some of the same ideas. So what you do is very important. I want to give you an outline of the lecture, my lecture tonight, so you know that where we're going. Part one, I'm going to start talking about Cold War foreign policy, and as Richard suggested, I'm going to look in depth at one particular document, NSC 48. And then from there, we're going to look at how the ideas expressed in NSC 48 shaped American culture in various ways. So part two, we'll look at travel writing. Then we'll look at the musical, and from there, we'll look at the racial formation of Asian Americans. But before I start my lecture, I'm really interested to know, how do you teach Cold War history? Which events do you focus on? Which foreign policy principles or documents do you emphasize? And do you use any kind of cultural artifacts in your classes? And if so, which ones?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have some really good questions on the table here. Please tell us, how do you teach the Cold War and what do you focus on? What documents do you use? Do you use things like political cartoons, photographs, movies, novels, and so on? Tina, we have some folks writing in. Let's see what they tell us. I know there's a lot of material out there. Okay, films, Atomic Cafe, Duck and Cover with Bert the Turtle. I have to confess, I'm not familiar with Bert the Turtle. The Berlin Wall, The Bay of Pigs, The Domino Theory, Duck and Cover. Don't really. Curriculum for Florida World History Middle School doesn't get into that time period, but they do show Bert the Turtle, though. Cartoons, NSC 68, focus on government policy, Cold War by Gaddis. Korean history, we introduced the Cold War using political cartoons, as well as comic books. I love showing Duck and Cover. The Iron Curtain speech, that's Churchill, the Korean War, nuclear arms race, photos of Nixon in China, focus on policies of each presidential and presidential administration, political cartoons, long telegrams, butter battle books. Wow, we've got JFK, the Iron Curtain, Khrushchev, atomic books, Atomic Cafe, speeches, Vietnam, Korea, similar to China, kitchen debate. Tina, these folks really cover the waterfront here. What do you think of all that?
These got a lot. Well, I think in a lot of ways, the standard history of the Cold War does tend to focus on the conflict with the Soviet Union and the development of the atomic bomb. I think the emotional tenor is often characterized really as with anxiety, which you can see, I think, in the whole duck and cover. I've just got a couple slides here. So a lot of, I think, anxiety about the atomic bomb, and here's our duck and cover. I do know the Bert the Turtle video, but I didn't include that. And I think there's often that Europe is seen as the center, as some of the comments suggest, the center of the Cold War. Here we have a picture of the Berlin airlift. Containment is certainly very important. It tends to get foregrounded as the central foreign policy with the Truman Doctrine speech in NSC 68. And when Asia does come in, it's often the place where the Cold War gets hot. In the Korean War and the Vietnam War, and where the containment practices really are put into place militarily. I'm going to present, I think, a somewhat different picture of the Cold War. I'm going to talk about the Cold War in Asia rather than in Europe. I'm going to talk about the foreign policy idea of integration in America's relationship with non-communist nations rather than the containment of America's communist enemies. And I'm going to talk about the cultural dimension of the Cold War as well as the political dimension. The questions that I want to start off with or invite you to think about during the talk are really how did the political ideology of the Cold War affect American popular culture of the 50s? And how does paying attention to works of culture help us understand the Cold War more fully? Um, and I want to start by introducing a concept, and this is the idea of a global imaginary. And I talk about this in the chapter from my book that it was in the reading packet. By global imaginary, I mean literally a worldview, a way of imagining the globe as a whole, a way of understanding how the world is organized and what America's proper role in that world is. It's really an expression of political ideology. It's a bundle of ideas that implies a certain distribution of power and that enables a certain set of actions. But it's also a product of culture. It's produced and disseminated by the images and stories and songs about that we tell about the world and about America's role in it. And I have a map here um, that helps us to see how containment was an ideology, it was a foreign policy, but it was also a global imaginary. And I think that this map that was published in Life magazine in 1947 can help us see this. And we have a question here. How does this map portray the relations between the United States and the Soviet Union?
Okay, we've got an
Do a little
interesting
research.
question here. Let's do a little image analysis. How does this map portray relationships, the relation between the United States and the Soviet Union? Tina, we got some folks typing in. Let's see what they have to say. I was actually, now when I think about it, I kind of do remember Bert the Turtle. Okay, we're completely ignoring the continent of Africa. Okay, maybe Tina, you want to address that. It portrays the central relationship. They are put in very close proximity, and the southern hemisphere is neglected. Central, I guess, yes, Russia and the U.S. are central here. Never considered them before being that close. See what other comments are coming in. Not equal in size. That is true. Yes, good point there. The United States is a lot smaller. Also, it struck me that Russia is above the United States, and it's sort of threatening and glowering down upon us. And look at those all those arrows, those orange arrows coming out, trying to influence each other's neighbors. The world was seen as just competing for members of the team. Yeah, just it's a bipolar world on this map. That's true. Russia is invading the rest of Asia. U.S. seems a lot more far-reaching. Russia looks like as if it's about to eat North America. Tina, what do you make of these responses?
Well, I think these are great. I mean, I think you can really see the idea of a global imaginary here because this map is so has to be centered on the North Pole in order to put America and Russia in such close proximity to each other, right? It's the only way that you can get this kind of an image. And it really emphasizes the opposition between the two of them. It really emphasizes conflict with a title that this is about world struggle and the use of that color, the red versus the white, and these gestural arrows seeming to head right at each other and pointing at each other really suggests this idea of conflict. I think it also suggests the idea of boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. And that's what we see in the red arrows emanating out from Russia and pointing into China and India and various parts of the world. This is the spread of communism that the United States has to really stop. So containment here is a way of imagining the globe, but it wasn't the only way that in the Cold War of imagining sort of the world view. Here's a very different map, and this is from 1955. Um, and here we see how the global imaginary of containment was really balanced by what I call the global imaginary of integration. And this expresses a very different political ideology rooted in the idea of collective security. And this map visualizes the world in terms of America's relationships with its allies. It locates America right smack in the center of a very stable network of lines that represent all the defense treaties that the US has with the non-communist nations of the world. And here it's interesting in this vision of the world, the Soviet Union is not central. It's been split in two and it's been really pushed to the margins of the map. So containment and integration were really two sets of foreign policies. There were two global imaginaries. There were two sides of the Cold War. One was really aimed at America's relationships with the communist world, and the other was aimed at America's relationship with the so-called free world. So enemies and allies. And this lecture is really going to be about the creation of the global imaginary of integration. That's what's most interesting to me. So let's turn to Asia. Um, the US has a long history of being interested in Asia, going all the way back to the 18th century, but the Cold War made Asia important to the US to an unprecedented degree. And really, you can see over the course of the 1940s and 1950s, the US was very involved in Asia, gave support for Chiang Kai shek in the Chinese Civil War, occupied Japan, there's the Korean War, there's the war in Vietnam. And the US also forged treaties across Asia with South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Thailand, Pakistan, Australia, New Zealand. And it created, developed networks of military bases across all these countries, many of these countries, and poured in lots and lots of money in terms of economic and military aid. And these policies really involved both containment and integration. Some were aimed at enemies and some others were aimed at allies. Um, but the question is, how did the US get here? How did we get to this point? And what prompted this enormous political and economic and military investment in Asia? And to answer this question, we have to jump back just a couple years and really look at the origins of the Cold War in Asia. And we have to look at one document in particular, which is NSC 48, which was in the reading packet, quite a long document. NSC 48 is not as well known as some other Cold War documents like NSC 68, but it's really essential to understanding how US policymakers were thinking about Asia. And it's really important because it articulated the ideals of US Asian integration. So I'm going to talk about it in some detail. In 1949, President Truman asked the National Security Council to help him to figure out what US foreign policy towards Asia should be. And the National Security Council responded with NSC 48, which is considered by historians to be the basic blueprint for the Cold War foreign policy in Asia. It's a series of top secret reports and memos, and they were written between 1949 and 1951. And they laid out, as you can see in the title here, America's objectives, policies, and courses of action in Asia. What you read was NSC 48/5, which is the final document. It's kind of a summary, and it brings all the key ideas and the policy proposals together. The first thing that NSC 48 did was to announce that the Asia was now the center of the Cold War. And it writes, in view of the communist resort to armed force in Asia, the United States' action in that area must be based on the recognition that the most immediate overt threats to United States security are currently presented in that area. And really, by the late 1940s, the situation in Europe was becoming pretty stabilized, in large part because of NATO, the successes of NATO, and the Marshall Plan. But events in Asia were really just starting to heat up. And the Cold War in Asia was really triggered by two key events that took place in 1949 and 1950, and by one ongoing process. So the first event, the first key event was the so-called, what gets called the loss of China. And this is in 1949, when the Chinese Civil War came to an end and Mao's Communist Party came into power. This causes, as you can imagine, a lot of anxiety in Washington. Suddenly there are 500 million more communists in the world. So this is a real political crisis for the US. The second event of this period is the outbreak of the Korean War. It happens just a few months later in June of 1950. And this is when the communist North Korea invades capitalist South Korea, which is, of course, allied with the US. Chinese troops join into the war, and together with the North Koreans, they rout the US forces and push them all the way down the peninsula. So this is a real military crisis. And these two events were so important because of the ongoing process of decolonization. And here we have a nice map of that. Starting in 1945, right after the end of World War II, people in Asia started throwing off many years of Western and Japanese colonial rule and establishing their own independent nations. And so you can see here that Korea and Taiwan were liberated from Japanese colonialism in 1945. Philippines gains independence from the US in 1946. India and Pakistan from Britain in 1947, and Burma in 1948. Indonesia becomes independent in 49. Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia from the French in 1954, and then finally Malaysia from the British in 1963. Decolonization meant that from Washington's perspective, all of Asia is now up for grabs. And in light of the communist success in China and North Korea, the members of the National Security Council believed that the Soviets were really going to push aggressively to get all of East Asia under their control. And so they're really worried that all these new countries would look to China as a model for how to develop their economies and improve the lives of their people.
Tina, if I could just interrupt here for a moment. We have a question here from one of our participants. Back a few slides ago, you talked about the United States building military bases in Asia, and Jason writes, could you say that there were networks of Soviet or Chinese bases in the area too? Were they trying to influence Asia by using some of the same tactics the U.S. was doing?
Well, from the US perspective at this point, all communism is they see as directed by the Soviet Union. So from Washington's perspective, the fact that China is communist, the fact that North Korea is communist, they see that as sort of Soviet actions and agency and proxies.
Mm-hmm.
And that the military forces of the Chinese Revolution, for instance, they see as a kind of an extension of Soviet military power from their perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was one of the major premises of NSC 68.
Yes.
Okay. Well, shall we move ahead then?
All right. So after asserting that Asia is now suddenly vulnerable to communism, the drafters of NSC 48, they really spell out exactly why the U.S. should care about this, right? What's Asia's strategic value to the U.S.? And they really focused on three things. They write the strategic significance of Asia arises from its resources, geography, and the political and military force which it could generate. Political and military force was really a function of population. There were over 1 billion people in Asia, and if all these people turned against the U.S., the world's balance of power could drastically and permanently shift against America. By resources, they're concerned with Asia's raw materials, which are of value to the U.S. economy and also to the military. And they're also concerned about Japan's potential for industrial development, which is, of course, quite significant. And geography is also an issue. It makes Asia strategically valuable. If Asia were to become communist, the U.S. would lose access to large parts of the globe, or at least that access would be compromised. And of course, it would have a devastating psychological effect on America's allies in the Middle East and Europe. So those are really the three big areas of Asia's strategic value. NSC, after establishing this, proceeds to outline Washington's objectives in Asia. And these really become the foundation for U.S. foreign policy because they spell out the kind of relationship that Washington wanted to have with Asia. And this is where we, I think, can see the two sides of Cold War foreign policy. The drafters of NSC 48, they talk a little bit about the need to contain the spread of communism in Asia, but most of the document really is focused on America's relationship with the non-communist countries of Asia. That's what they're most interested in here. So what do these integration-based objectives look like? And what kind of language was used to characterize these objectives? Because I think that the language of NSC 48 is quite interesting. NSC 48 advocated really for the military affiliation of the U.S. and Asia, and it called for the development and establishment of mutual security arrangements for the Pacific area. And I think mutual is really the key word here, and it's this idea that security can only be achieved by the U.S. and Asian countries working together. NSC 48 also called for political affiliation with the U.S., and it sought the development of stable and self-sustaining non-communist governments oriented towards the United States and friendly towards the United States. I think the suggestion here is of intellectual and emotional ties. And it also calls for economic integration. The U.S. sought to maximize the availability through mutually advantageous arrangements of the material resources of the Asian area to the United States and the free world generally, and thereby correspondingly deny these resources to the communist world. And this is really to say that the U.S. wanted to ensure access to Asian markets, and they wanted to integrate Asia into the free world capitalist economy. In the age of decolonization, the U.S. really says we want exchange that benefits both parties. We do not want to continue the economic exploitation that was common in the colonial era. That's not what we're interested in. After this, the NSC 48 goes on to identify the problems that the U.S. was facing and the obstacles that stood in the way of its objectives. And it identifies really three big ones. One of them is Asian leadership. The drafters of NSC 48 are worried that about the weakness in the leadership of non-communist Asian countries. Washington feared that the existing leaders would be unable to handle the huge problems that these leaders were facing. So there's problems of poverty, there's problems of economic development, there's problems of post-colonial and post-war nation building. So NSC 48 advocates cultivating a new generation of leaders. And the drafters write, the United States should give the most thorough consideration to means to encourage the development of competent leadership and to stimulate its rise in the countries of Asia. And I think that we can read competent here as a euphemism for oriented towards the United States. That's what they mean by competent. A second problem was European colonialism. And one of the most important problems that the US faced was Asian resentments and suspicions towards the West. Asia was, as with decolonization, is in the midst of throwing off colonial rule. And so while the US is preaching the value of democracy, it did recognize that democracy has too often been associated with the privileged white man and the memories of colonial exploitation. An earlier report in the NSC 48 series was even more explicit. And it says that Washington must not take any action in Asia that will expose the US to charges of imperialism and must work instead to preserve the US traditional reputation as a non-imperialistic champion of freedom and independence for all nations. So really, the big challenge for the US is to achieve its political and economic and military objectives in Asia, but without being seen as an imperial power, which is a kind of a fine line to walk. A third and related problem was the problem of American racism. And the drafters of NSC 48 highlighted what they called the problem of American personnel who don't have the temperament suitable for life in Asia. And this is a polite way of saying that they're worried that the people that they're sending to Asia to implement US foreign policy are going to reveal themselves to be bigots. And this was really a problem because racism was seen as a sign of colonialism. And so the drafters of NSC 48 emphasized that our aim must constantly be one of avoiding the impression that the United States endeavors to colonize or Americanize those countries to which aid is being given. And I have here a slide that really makes clear, I think, how big a problem racism was for US foreign policy in Asia in the 40s and the 50s. This is, of course, the early years of the US civil rights movement. And so what happens is that every spectacular episode of racism at home gets picked up by the Soviet Union and trumpeted as proof that the US really is really just another racist colonial power like the French, like the British. And so you can see this in this example of their propaganda, a piece of propaganda from 1948. And so if you have a question here, how would you interpret these images looking at how it presents life under capitalism and life under socialism?
Okay. I think, Tina, this would make an excellent teaching tool, not just for discussing Asia, but for discussing the Cold War in general. So let's see what our participants have to say. How do you interpret these images? Torture versus cooperation and integration? Yeah. I mean, the V.B. Koretsky, the author, the designer of these posters, I mean, he knew how to use American imagery. There's the Statue of Liberty and apparently a silhouette of New York above somebody who looks as if he's being lynched. Wonderful tool showing communist perspective. The crowd behind the two leaders there marching, triumphantly into the future. That's a mixed group. I mean, you've got Asian folks back there. You've got ladies with headscarves. I like this image, very typical for the propaganda used by Eastern Europe. A wonderful tool showing communist perspective. And we have color in the one on the right there. The red, obviously, very vivid, very attracts your attention. Depends on who's delivering the propaganda. For communists, great. For capitalists, it's a lie. Socialism equals diversity. Are they referencing Japanese American internment camps? Yeah, the figure on the left there, kind of ethnic background is a little. It's not. I don't know. It's not entirely clear.
I think that's pretty clearly an African American
Yeah,
man.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Interesting that the people on the Soviet side are often represented by seemingly religious identities. Interesting point. How is this alive for capitalism? I'm jumping in late, but the communism was actually helpful in spurring civil rights legislation. The propaganda was an embarrassment to the United States because it was true. Tina, what do you make of the responses here?
I think they're great. I think it's really what you can see here is just that how racism at home is linked to foreign policy abroad, how it's linked to the Cold War, and how it really creates a problem. It's a problem for the U.S. throughout the 50s, and the Soviet Union is quick to pick up on it and make it very embarrassing because it does undermine claims, America's claims to be the leader, a legitimate leader in Asia. It undermines claims. American claims to not be imperialist, because there's always that linkage of racism and colonialism. If you're racist, it's proof that you're a colonialist, that you'll what you do at home, you'll also do abroad. And that's really the Soviets really push on that. But let me just wrap up with NSC 48. And I think that what we see in this particular document is that it articulates a very particular worldview. And it's a vision of the world in which the US and free Asia are closely bound up with one another. So what exactly are the terms of this global imaginary of integration, as I call it? It presents a vision of Asia that's oriented towards America, that's friendly towards America, that's guided by a new generation of leaders. It presents a vision of America that's a non-imperial presence in Asia. It's not interested in dominating or Americanizing people. And importantly, that it's a racially tolerant people, Americans are. And then that relationship between Asia and America, it imagines in terms of solidarity with a larger free world, and this idea of mutually advantageous exchange, that capitalism is a kind of is mutually advantageous exchange rather than exploitation. Um, so what I think is important is that the global imaginary of containment was really about maintaining the boundaries between communist and free nations, whether it's the sort of Iron Curtain or the Bamboo Curtain, making sure that communism stays on the other side, but that the global imaginary of integration was very much about making connections across barriers, of culture, of language, of race, of history, all those differences that exist between the US and Asia. And NSC 48 is really about um, urging the creation of a community, the free world community in which both Asians and Americans would belong. So let's leave NSC 48 and move on. Um, After the National Security Council articulates this vision of America's new relationship to Asia, the next step is really to disseminate it. It has to get the word out. It has to get the word out to all the various branches of the U.S. government so that these ideas can be implemented in concrete foreign policies or domestic policies. But it also has to disseminate these ideas publicly. It has to get them out to the American people so that Americans would understand and support these policies. And this is where we start to move away from the people in Washington who are making foreign policy, and we start moving towards people in the rest of America who are making culture. Um, we always sort of assumed that the Cold War was kind of a done deal, that it was inevitable. But at the time, there was a real concern that Americans would not get behind the waging of the Cold War, that they weren't ready for world leadership. Um, there was fear these policies were going to be too expensive. Americans wanted to focus on their own lives and families and homes in the 50s. They didn't know that much about Asia. They didn't care about Asia. And there's a real concern about a lingering isolationist sentiment in America. So policymakers felt that they had to persuade Americans that the Cold War in Asia was worth waging. And they had to win the minds, as they called it. They had to win the minds of the American people, and really encourage them to turn their attention out to the world and not just inside at America. And so to do this, government officials disseminated the ideas contained in NSC 48 as widely as they could. So they gave speeches, they gave interviews to journalists, they tried to get the word out to anyone who could shape public opinion. And the result was that the ideas that were contained in NSC 48 circulated quite widely throughout post-war American culture. The ideas themselves were not in any way top secret. They were widely publicized. Um, and we can see an example of this effort to disseminate these ideas and win the minds of Americans in a 1957 speech that Francis Wilcox gave to a group of educators. I think the speech was in the reading packet. And he's a kind of mid-level State Department official. Um, and Wilcox urged the educators to help train the next generation of Americans for their role of world leadership. And he urged them to teach them about the new nations of Asia. And he said that all Americans needed an education for overseasmanship, is how he phrased it. And he meant something really interesting by this. He said, educators must cultivate the quality of empathy, the ability to put yourself in the other fellow's position and see things from his point of view. We must understand the hopes and problems and attitudes of other peoples if we're going to be fully effective in our efforts to help them, and by so doing, to help ourselves. And I just think this is a very interesting vision of education, and I'm wondering what you all think about it as educators. What kind of an education does he think that teachers should be providing in the late 1950s?
Okay, we have that question on the table. In the meantime, one of our participants, Elizabeth Salima, and I hope I pronounced your name properly, Elizabeth, writes, I read an essay in college called Black Like Mao, Civil Rights Movement in America, that the civil rights movement in America was definitely tied to socialist movements in Asia that proved America to be hypocritical. Perhaps you would want to count on that, Tina, a comment on that. Let's see what our other participants are writing in. What kind of education is Mr. Wilcox suggesting here? And maybe we could expand that question a little bit. How does that differ from what you're being told to teach today? Seems to be a romantic notion of education. That's interesting comment. What else? Are we being urged to teach understanding in seeing ourselves in the other from the other person's point of view today? Let's see. It's coming over. Um, I do remember that kind of history that we were getting in the 50s and 60s. Amelia writes, on one hand, we should teach our students to be good world citizens. On the other hand, he's suggesting something that feels a lot like Kipling's The White Man's Burden. Help them to help us. Tina, what do you think?
Well, I mean, what I think is so interesting in this is, and I think that this romantic notion of education, that comment is quite interesting. He doesn't urge teachers to teach Asian history, and he's not urging them to teach Asian languages, but
Mm-hmm.
it's really a cultivation of new attitudes, is what he's pushing for. Um, and to me, one of the things that's interesting is how the language of Wilcox's speech is so different from the language of NSC 48, which is, of course, very dry and dull and bureaucratic language. And Wilcox here is translating these ideas of NSC 48 into the language of education, the language of feeling, and the language really of interpersonal relationships, right? Seeing things from another person's point of view. Um, and I think this idea is what the Cold War requires from Americans is empathy, is understanding of being able to see things from a new point of view. That's kind of what the concern is, certainly for this State Department official, is changing American attitudes and to have that kind of worldview and world perspective. That's what they want to encourage, to even to think about and care about what's going on in Asia. Um, What's also interesting is that government officials realized that they couldn't do this whole job of educating Americans and winning the minds of Americans by themselves. It was just too big a task for them. And in 1950, the members of the National Security Council discussed the need to get private American citizens on board as well. And Robert Lovett, who was the Deputy Secretary of Defense, he suggested soliciting the voluntary cooperation of private citizens who could take America's case, who could take the government's case before the public. And so here's another, I think, quite interesting quote. In this document, it says, we must meet the threat of international communism in the field of ideas. If we can sell every useless article known to man in large quantities, we should be able to sell our very fine story in larger quantities. Lovett said America had a terrible problem of public information and support And he urged that we get in what he called a group of paraphrasers who could turn what it is we have to say to the American people into understandable terms for the average man on the street. So, what do you think about this, about the State Department and the Defense Department asking prominent Americans to paraphrase and to sell the Cold War to the public?
This is absolutely fascinating to me that the State Department would try to enlist Americans to paraphrase the State Department and the government's official Cold War line. And the most interesting question of our two here on the table is, who were the paraphrasers? Let's hear what our teachers have to say about that. Who were the paraphrasers? And what do we think about trying to get Americans to propagandists? Okay, Cheryl writes propagandists. I like the acknowledged link between business and government here. The business of America is business. Mary writes, not very different from World War I and World War II in terms of bringing on individuals that the average American can relate to. That's true. Capitalist to the last, like our metaphor, sell it to the public. Hollywood, I think we found one of our paraphrasers there. I tend to think that we would lean on the motion picture industry. Another vote for Hollywood. Let's see what else. Now, Tina, does this mean that the State Department was consciously funding paraphrasing efforts in American popular culture?
No, it was more that they wanted to get people on board.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it sounds perhaps odd when we read it now, but of course people are patriotic. People want to participate. As it's like in World War II, people want to fight the good fight. They're happy to sort of get involved in doing what's right and what's patriotic and to support their country. So it's not about the government paying people to do this, but almost more about the government inspiring people, asking people to participate, and patriotic people saying, sure, I'm happy to get on board.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One of the things that's I think is interesting, and who they had in mind in this particular a document, they're talking about, prominent sort of maybe political figures or sort of publicly known figures, but who turns out to be some of the best paraphrasers are really the producers of middlebrow culture. Um, and by middlebrow, I mean it's popular culture that aims to be entertaining, but it tends to be high quality, to be educational, to be significant, to be kind of important popular culture. And what you see in the 40s, the late 1940s and 50s, is just a flood, an outpouring of middlebrow culture about Asia. That there's novels and short stories and plays and musicals and movies and travel books and memoirs, all this stuff about Asia. And I think this is really where you can see the cultural Cold War in America. You can see this effort to turn American attention out into the world, turn that attention out to Asia, and to really educate Americans about Asia. Now, some of the people who are producing these cultural texts, some of the artists and writers, they were acting as intentional paraphrasers, what I call intentional paraphrasers, that US officials asked them to help out and they agreed. But others were what I call unintentional paraphrasers, which is to say that they kind of did the work of disseminating the ideals of NSC 48 without being asked. They were simply internationalist-minded people. They wanted to encourage their fellow Americans to embrace their new role in the world. They thought it was really important. They thought that if Americans were continued to be isolationists, it would be really dangerous. So there's a lot of people who are interested in it without being specifically asked to. But what these cultural producers do, what they help produce, is what I call this global imaginary of integration. And this is turning Washington's foreign policy ideals in regard to Asia, turning it into stories, turning it into characters, turning it into images, turning it into feelings, turning it into songs, turning it into material that Americans can understand and can feel, and will want to engage with, will want to consume. I want to turn to one particular genre of middlebrow culture, and that's travel writing, because there was a real explosion of travel writing in the late 1940s and 1950s, in books and in magazines, and even whole new magazines devoted to travel, like Holiday. And this is the cover of the inaugural issue of Holiday magazine. It's in March of 1946. So it's really before the Cold War in Asia starts going and starts kind of heating up. But it's such an amazing image. And in fact, I like this image so much, I bought the magazine on eBay because it's such an amazing image. But I invite you to interpret this as to, how does it position Americans in relation to Asia?
Okay, we have a question. How does this image position Americans in relation to Asia? We already have one response. It positions them as visitors. I'm fascinated by the fact that they're standing on thin air. Tourists, okay? Yeah, let's see what else we have to say. And some other folks are responding here. Um, let's see. Marianne McElroy writes, I can't help but notice that dinner at the Waldorf was $4.95. Okay, dinner at McDonald's today, $4.95. Things have changed, haven't they? Consumers. They also, I mean, this quality of standing in space, it gives me the sense that they're sort of agog at all this. This is kind of, fascinating and exotic. And also, then you've got the technology of transatlantic air flight there, which was relatively new back in the 50s. Asia is colorful and exciting. Yeah, yeah.
And there's, I
Let's
think,
see
a
what
sense
else
that
we have.
Asia's available, that they can stand there,
Yeah.
they can look at it, they can go there, and they've got all their leisure equipment. I don't know if you can see, but it's a golf clubs and a tennis racket and a fishing pole, and
Mm-hmm.
um, that it's this sense of availability and access, I think, is quite
Mm-hmm.
interesting.
Mm-hmm. Looks as if let's see, staring at it as if looking were to travel to Asia. And of course, that's what Holiday Magazine is all about. You can visit there by reading Holiday Magazine, a wonderful publication, by the way, in its day. Bringing American culture with them to Asia. How long was Holiday published? Holiday, what, into the Tina, it ran into what, the
I
70s or
I
so, I
don't
think.
remember how late. I don't remember how late it went. It really was an amazing magazine because it was
Hmm.
large format and it had really good
Yeah,
writers. But they paid
yeah,
well and they
yeah,
brought in really great writers. So
yeah, yeah.
it's quite an interesting magazine for a lens onto the 50s and the 60s.
We have a question here. Is this integration policy responsible for why we import so much from East Asia now? Uh,
So actually that is a great question because if you think about integration, then you get a different vision on the Cold War, and it is absolutely about the integration of the world capitalist economy, right? That
mhm,
it's all those countries that are not that are not communist. Let's integrate them into a sort of a political unity and an economic unity. So it
mhm,
absolutely is in that sort of long history of the Cold War, the long history of globalization. It's a crucial part of it. So that's a great question.
mhm, mhm. And Rashida writes, Asia is within the common man's reach. I'm not entirely sure Holiday was aimed at the common man, but certainly it is within the reach of affluent travelers here in 1946.
Yeah, and this
So
is
we have about 45 minutes to go, Tina.
okay, so I'll keep chugging along. What's interesting about travel writing in the 50s is a lot of it took on an overtly political flavor. It's about Americans going to Asia, discovering Asia, learning about Asia, telling their neighbors about Asia. So it's a real educational genre and also a very internationalist one in that sense of turning Americans' attention out to the world, which I think you can see in this image. Um, the single most important, or certainly important and popular writer about Asia in the 1950s was James Michener. I don't know if he's still sort of around, if you all know who James Michener was. But he worked across a range of genres, but was really strongly identified with travel writing. And he wrote lots of newspaper and magazine articles and nearly a dozen books about Asia, and was really one of the most important producers of popular knowledge about Asia in this period. And Michener was a fascinating guy because he was one of the intentional paraphrasers of US foreign policy. He willingly used his writing to disseminate ideas that Washington wanted to be disseminated. U.S. ambassadors frequently invited him to write about the issues in their countries and explain what was going on in their countries. The Defense Department asked him to write about a new weapons system, and he happily complied. And what I love is that he served as the front man for a CIA funded organization that was carrying on a long term covert operation in Asia. And he was an integral part of that. And he was fully witting as that it was a CIA front organization. So he's a really interesting guy. Um, but Michener wasn't just doing Washington's bidding. He had a master's degree in education. He'd taught college for a couple of years, and he was a really committed internationalist. So he saw his writing as a way to educate Americans about what was at stake in Asia, and he probably, frankly, would have done it even without the government asking to write it, some of the things that he wrote. Um, so he published this book in 1951, The Voice of Asia, that does a lot of paraphrasing. It's a collection of short travel essays, and I think three of them were in the reading packet for you. The book as a whole talks about the big changes that are taking place in Asia after World War II. And I want to look at a couple of these essays and see how he paraphrases some of the key ideas of NSC 48 and this whole idea of US Asian integration. Um, some of the essays that he's writing about focus on Americans, and they offer lessons in how to be an American in Asia. Like Francis Wilcox's speech, they offer an education in overseasmanship. And throughout the book, Michener really models himself. He models the new attitudes that Americans should take towards Asia, and he critiques the old attitudes that they must abandon. So that same sort of idea that Wilcox will deal with later about what are the attitudes that Americans have. In the Singapore essay, which is quite short, Michener presents himself as the opposite of someone who's trying to dominate or Americanize Asian people. And he explains how he gathered his information for his essays. He had conversations with ordinary Asian people of all complexions. He asked hundreds of questions. He encouraged them to tell him their fears and their desires and aspirations. And as he engages in these conversations, I think that Michener really intentionally disavows colonial power relations in which the Westerner occupies the position of superiority. And he says that once he gets his interviewees going, he just sits back and he listens. He says, I listened for 15 or 16 hours a day. And so Michener becomes passive rather than active. He becomes receptive rather than aggressive, and he becomes a listener rather than a talker. And by being this kind of passive listening man, he discovers, or purports to discover, that every Asian wants the same thing. Quotes, he wanted America at least to understand his position. He wanted us to be on his side. Um, so by trying to understand rather than dominate Asian people, Michener discovers they want to affiliate themselves with America. And this is, of course, the central objective of U.S. foreign policy in Asia, right? Is that idea of being on the same side. Michener also echoes NSC 48's concern about the problem of American personnel in Asia. And when Asian people ask him, or when they assume that he's going to make fun of their country and what he writes, he's appalled and he asks, what kind of Americans have we been sending abroad? And clearly he implies the wrong kind, ignorant, arrogant. And he then explicitly offers himself up as a model for how Americans should behave in Asia. And quote, he writes, America should have some of its ablest young men doing for months and years what I did for some days. And that is listening empathetically and understanding other people's point of view. And in the essays, many of the essays that result from this method of interviewing, Michener allows the Asian people to speak for themselves. Many of the essays, he writes them as monologues in which an Asian person explains his views. And this, in turn, this monologue format allows the American reader to see the world from that person's perspective, to step into his shoes. So what's interesting is that the very form of these essays, the way that they're written, in addition to what they write, their content, I think allows the reader to develop these feelings of empathy and understanding towards Asian people that Francis Wilcox would later urge American teachers to cultivate in their students. So he embeds that very much in the form of the essay. In another essay that he writes called 3 Rupees Sahib, Michener takes up the question of economic relations between Americans and Asia. And where the NSC 48 talks about Asia's raw materials, Michener tells a story about a boat ride. And he writes about his encounter with Sea Cantor, a boatman in Rangoon, Burma. And he hires the Sea Cantor for a quick trip, he calls it, across the river and back for just 3 rupees. But this boatman is very entrepreneurial, he has other ideas, and he persuades Michener pretty much against his will to see sites further along the river for a gradually increasing price. And Michener is getting annoyed as he keeps getting to see one thing and then another thing and then another. But when they finally turn back toward the city, Michener is presented with a spectacular view. And he writes, a breath of clean salt air struck us, and across the river the varied wonderful lights of Rangoon shone in the darkness. The temples were gaudily ablaze, and the towers shimmered in the darkness. It was a magnificent sight, breathtaking and superb. Here were the rivers of Asia, magnificent and enormous and crowded with life. Here were the stars of Asia, spectacular in the night sky. And there was Sea Cantor behind me, laughing, for he had planned it this way. He said nothing as we sped across the awe-inspiring river, for he was content with what he had accomplished. But as I climbed ashore, he grinned and said, Sahib, forgive me. I had to keep you at the rice mill, to wait for the stars. Was that not worth the 15th rupee? Um, and I think that we can connect this passage to the idea of economic integration expressed in NSC 48. And I'm wondering how you would see that connection, or how can you make that connection?
Okay, do we see this as economic integration here? And CI, I apologize that your packet didn't include all of our readings, an oversight. Let's see. What do our folks have to say? Turning viewing nature into an act of commerce. Way to go, budding capitalist. All right. Let's see what else we have to say. Well, all the readings on the webinar homepage, that's true. Go there. Okay, what other comments? What struck me about this was the Asians' willingness to cooperate here and really having the best interests of his American tourist at heart. He wanted to do something special for him. So it suggests that Asians, despite what they may think of America as a country, that individually they can relate to Americans, and they like us, and they want to take care of us. And also, this passage raises the possibility of misunderstanding between the Americans and Asians, clearly showing that Secantor is showing an American what is really important. Good point. Tina, what do you make of that?
Well, I think it's interesting is that there, there's a certain amount of anxiety that this is going to be an exploitative relationship. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, in this story, it's the American, it's Michener who might be being exploited. But the sort of the drama of the essay is that it turns out it's not an exploitive relationship. It's mutually advantageous exchange, right? It's equal exchange that Seacantor gives access to Burma's resources in the sense of this gorgeous view, and Michener pays him a fair price for it, which is the 15 rupees that he thinks he's being ripped off by this this local guide. But it turns out it's not animosity, it's not conflict. They're working together, they can exchange, everybody can get what they want, everybody's happy. And this is the essence of the kind of ideal relationship that I think NSC 48 is kind of advocating for, is that we can make it be about exchange and not exploitation. um, and again, I think it's Michener here as a model. He presents himself as a model for Americans abroad. It's like, okay, there's all this tourism. People are starting to travel to Asia. Let me show you how to do it, how to do it right, and what kind of a relationship you want to enter into with people. There's another essay, the new Mem-Sahibs, where Michener takes a really different approach. And here he offers a model of how Americans should not behave abroad, and he illustrates the ideas that they should abandon. And he begins the essay by describing the racist behavior of European colonialists, especially the European women and British women. And he explains that those days are over. Post-colonial Asian society will no longer accept white domination. And from there, he asserts that American women are now embracing these outmoded racist views. And he writes, it is disturbing, therefore, to find that today, in the first flush of America's world responsibilities, many American women, fresh from two-room apartments, have picked up the Mem-Sahib racket right where the English women left off. I have heard half a dozen American women sipping tea and saying in self-pity, if we Americans pulled out of here tomorrow, within 6 months, these characters would be back in trees. And he writes, if Americans persist in such ideas, if they persist in playing the role of great white father and Mem-Sahib, our efforts to win Asia to our side are absolutely doomed. And I think it's interesting to think about how Michener is framing the problem of racism and its effect on U.S. foreign policy. And I wonder what you think he's doing there.
Okay. What do we think Michener is doing here? How is he framing the problem of racism and its effect on U.S. foreign policy? Okay, yes, American women are stepping into the Mem-Sahib racket. They're behaving rather Britishly, I suppose. White man's burden is refuted. Yes, he's Michener, I think, would be refuting that. I think there was clearly reminding Americans of the white man's burden and how that impacted Great Britain eventually. A sense of American cultural superiority is strong after World War II. See what our other participants are writing in. Yeah, this is a cautionary passage here. He's telling us this isn't the way you want to behave. That would be more like the white man's burden. He is showing how, if we don't change American racist tendencies, our foreign policy of integration won't work. I think that's really insightful, Tina. What do you think of that?
I think it absolutely is. It's, it's an essay about, look, if your racism, your prejudice, and he figures it always as individual personal prejudice, your prejudice can undermine our foreign policy. It can
Hmm.
really just take it off the tracks. But I think this idea of the comment that America is so kind of powerful after World War II is interesting because it suggested American women fresh from two-room apartments have picked up the Mem-Sahib racket. So there's this sense that here's these women, they're not that rich at home, but boy, they go abroad, they go to Asia, suddenly they can have all this power as Americans. And that attitude's a problem. And that Americans should be, yes, take up this role of world leadership. Yes, America is very powerful, but they have to do it with modesty. And they have to leave their old prejudices behind. Like those prejudices don't have a place any longer in this sort of new world, this new post-colonial and post-war world. And I think that what we see with Michener is very common in a lot of travel writing is this a lot of paraphrasers, as it were, are really condemning racism. And they, except they don't call it racism, they call it prejudice. And it's always individual prejudice. They can't, they're really the limits of this. They can't think about what we would call today institutional racism, but they can see it as individuals having the wrong, having bad ideas. And if individuals, and especially in this case, women, which I think is quite interesting, if women would just give up their prejudices, then foreign policy in Asia would be fine, and we could get what we need to happen.
Hmm. I think a perfect example of this is the musical South Pacific, which of course was taken from Michener's Tales of the South Pacific. I know that in the South, some places that was banned because of the interracial relationship between two of the characters.
Absolutely, absolutely, and the whole thing about of being sort of anti-racism in the 50s is very interesting because on the one hand, Secretary of State Dulles says, look, it's our Achilles heel in foreign policy. American racism is just a disaster for us abroad because Asia is so important, the third world, the developing world, the decolonizing world is so important for us, and we're sort of shooting ourselves in the foot with this stuff. And at the same time, with McCarthyism, if you're committed to fighting racism, that's a sign that, well, you are probably likely to be a communist.
Hmm.
So anti-racism is sort of plays on both sides of the political spectrum, and it's quite complicated in this period as to what does it mean. But the linking up, one of the things I think is so interesting is the linking up of domestic American life, sort of what's happening within the US, is so closely tied to what's happening abroad with foreign policy in Asia. And so often when we teach history, we teach, well, there's domestic political history and there's foreign policy history. But one of the things that's interesting about the Cold War is to see how they're related. And not just McCarthyism at home and anti-com and containment abroad, but to think about, well, racism at home and the need to encourage affiliation on the part of the third world with America. Those are different ways to see those connections between the foreign and domestic policies.
Hmm. We've got about 30 minutes to go.
Mhm. All right, well, so let's move on. Let's look to another genre of popular writing, of popular culture, which is the musical. And like the essay, like the travel essay, the musical was a great genre for carrying Cold War ideology. And in fact, one film scholar has described the musical as a genre of integration because Hollywood musicals, Broadway musicals almost always tell stories about people overcoming their differences and joining together and forming some sort of a community. So Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein were, like Michener, among the most prolific producers of popular culture, popular knowledge about Asia during the Cold War. And over the course of the late 40s and 50s, they wrote three very popular shows, all of which were made into very popular films. South Pacific, based on the short stories, as you say, by James Michener, The King and I, which is about Thailand or Siam, and Flower Drum Song, which is about Asian Americans in contemporary San Francisco. And I want to talk about The King and I. And The King and I, the story that it tells is about a Western woman who's named Anna Leon Owens, who travels to Thailand, Siam at the time, in the late 19th century to serve as a governess to the king's large brood of children. And here, although she's actually British, all her cultural references and political references are to America, so she kind of functions as an American figure in the show. So the king hires Anna as part of his plan to modernize his country. And much of the musical shows Anna explaining Western ideas to the king and teaching his children and wives about Western behaviors and Western modes of thinking. So this is essentially a story about the modernization of a small Asian country under the tutelage of the West. And as such, it really resonated with contemporary political theories of modernization and with Washington's foreign policies of economic aid and development. And as with the Michener essays, I want to look at how the film paraphrases some of the key ideals of U.S.-Asian integration that were expressed in NSC 48. And I want to look at the scene early on in the film, and it's set in the classroom in which Anna is teaching the children and the wives about geography. And this is really a scene about education and modernization, in which the Siamese children learn a new way to think about themselves and about their position in the world. And so the scene begins with an old Siamese map of America, and you can see it there in the background. And it depicts Siam as very large, it's bright red, it's positioned right in the center of this map, and it has a large figure of the king superimposed on it. And next to it in green is Siam's traditional enemy, which is Burma. It's small, and it has a naked little figure superimposed on it. That's their weak king of Burma. So this is clearly a Siamese view of the world. But Anna quickly dismisses this map and she introduces a new map. She covers it up with a brand new map and she says it's just arrived from England, she tells them. And she points to Siam, which is now very small and quite marginal. It's no longer at the center of the map. And the teenage Prince Chulalongkorn, who is the king's eldest son and the heir to the throne, he gets very upset at this new map and he shouts, but Siam is not so small. And Anna then points to England and tells him that, look, England is even smaller. And so the prince is mollified, and he accepts this new Western vision of how the world is organized and how Siam fits into that world. After this geography lesson, the map stays there in the background, and then there's the musical number. I'm sure you all know it, Getting to Know You, and I hope you had a chance to look at the clip of the scene. But the number shows Anna teaching the king's children and wives how to shake hands, how to bow, how to curtsy. And as she does so, she sings with the children and the wives about the pleasures of getting to know each other. And I have the song's lyrics up here. I'm afraid I'm not going to sing them for you, but you can read along. But I think, again, it's the question, this recurring question, well, how do we see this scene and this song and this exchange of maps paraphrasing the ideals of NSC 48? How's it expressing the ideals of NSC 48? How is it doing that work?
Okay. Tina, we have a question here that's really interesting. Is The King and I still banned in Thailand? I didn't know it was banned there to begin with. Do you know?
Yes, yeah, the Thai people do not like this film
They don't
at
like
all.
it. Well,
They do not like it at all. And they don't like it because for a number of reasons. One, it turns the king into a sort of a silly figure a little bit.
yeah.
They don't think it's very respectful, and it remains a crime to this day. You can't disrespect the king of Thailand.
Oh,
But it's also that it makes Anna, this British woman, the agent of Siam's modernization, and they don't
mhm.
like that because, of course, it was the king, and it was Prince Chulalongkorn who really are very active in that modernization. So this idea that it would be a British woman who's responsible for that is very insulting to them, very offensive.
Well, so much for our policy of integration and anti-racism here. Let's see. We have a lot of people commenting that they love The King and I. This is an example of soft power. You know, I had never when I went through this material you're presenting, it never occurred to me why they focused on Uncle Tom's Cabin as the little play that they put on, and of
Mm,
course an anti-slavery abolitionist work. It makes sense that
yes.
Uncle Tom's Cabin, or the little, what was it, the Little Cabin of Uncle Tom,
Little House of Uncle
the
Tom.
little
Yes, the
house of Uncle.
small house of Uncle Tom.
Right, the Small House of Uncle Tom is the one literary work that they cite here, and of course it's American, not British. Very significant. Okay, couching American overtures as as friendly and non-threatening shows that the U.S. can keep our customs and still respect others. It certainly highlights the need for learning and exchange to happen on both sides of a relationship, as NSC 48 promotes. It was the prince that modernized Thailand, but Anna was portrayed as the one who opened their minds. And then we have the little house of Uncle Thomas. So yeah, this. Also, I mean, NSC 48 called for training a new generation of Asian leadership. And one of the things Anna does is teach the king how to be something of a Democrat. She's teaching him as well as she's teaching the children as well. Um, the scene expresses the power of humbleness. Ah, yes, going back to Michener's point, when forming new relationships. We have some other comments coming in. See what we have to say. I think our participants have seen NSC 48 reflected in The King and I. Tina, what do you think?
All right. Well, I think what you say is very interesting, and I'll come back to that about a new generation of leadership. I think the scene is really shows a change in the orientation of the Siamese, right? Remember, NSC 48 puts all this emphasis on fostering the emergence of non-communist governments that would be oriented towards the United States and friendly towards the United States. And this is we really see the process by which the Siamese learn to orient themselves in a new way. And they learn to orient themselves not according to their traditional neighbor and their traditional enemy Burma, but they learn to orient themselves in relationships to the West. So they get a new map, a new vision of themselves in the world. And as the song turns into the musical number, they're learning the social rules, Western social rules that will enable them to engage the West on its terms, right? They learn how to be more Western to engage with the West more effectively. And the song itself, Getting to Know You, is a virtual anthem of integration ideals, right? It really celebrates that process of crossing boundaries, of forging a community, of demonstrating emotional and intellectual ties that bind this community together. Because Anna and the children, they sing together, they dance together, they learn together. Anna holds one of the children's on her kids on her lap. There's the fan dance. Anna's learning. There's this sort of idea of cultural exchange going in both directions. But of course, it's really Anna who's changing them. They're not changing Anna. But I think the emotional tenor is really important here because this is the joyous side of the Cold War. And I think it's really important to recognize that there was a joyous side to the Cold War. It wasn't all duck and cover, it wasn't all anxiety and fear of communists in the State Department. But the Cold War, a lot of it was about learning about a different culture, make new friends, have new experiences, be open to Asia because we need Asia. And this is, you wonder why all college students go abroad now. Well, getting to know you is kind of why they go abroad. It really has these roots in the 50s in the Cold War. Um, but it's also a scene about the cultivation of new Asian leadership, Richard, as you suggested. NSC 48 is very concerned with new Asian leadership. And this scene is about Prince Chulalongkorn expressing resistance and being won over. And the scene ends, or rather, the film ends with Prince Chulalongkorn will replace his father as the ruler of Siam. And his first action as ruler is to issue a proclamation against bowing, right? That's the first thing he does. In the film, of course, if you remember it, or the show, bowing has been the visual marker of the king's pre-modern anti-democratic political tyranny, right? He makes everyone obey him unquestioningly. He's not a democrat. But this is what the young king says in his proclamation. He says, "Up, rise up. There shall be no more bowing like toad, no crouching, no crawling. You will stand with shoulders back and chin high. You will face king with proud expression, showing pride in self as well as in king. This is proper way for men to show esteem to one another, by looking upon each other's faces with kindness of spirit, eyes meeting eyes in equal gaze, bodies upright, standing as men were meant to stand, with dignity." Um, and as he's giving this proclamation, the old king dies. right? So this speech is the exact moment of a kind of transfer of power from the old-fashioned king to this new young king. Um, and so I'm interested, how do you see this speech expressing Cold War ideals? Um,
Okay, we have that question on the table, and Tina, while our participants are typing in, I think we need to point out that Marianne McElroy makes an interesting point about how this integration was a two-way street. She says Anna learns to appreciate Thai culture and the king, and of course the king appreciates Western culture as well.
yeah.
And however, you know, the cross-cultural the transformation here is not wholesale and complete. One of our participants points out, Karen Bernasek points out, Anna's manner of dress, clear that she doesn't adapt to more appropriate dress. Yeah, I can imagine wearing all those things in Thailand. It's a little warm. Anyway, we're getting on here to the Prince's Proclamation. Meredith writes, suggests the notion of natural rights in every person, not just in a monarchy. Uh, the prince is a young leader tilted toward the west. The children mock her large skirt. The Prince's Proclamation reflects a Western perspective. And here we get back to NSC 48. We have just educated a new leader in Asia. What do you think, Tina?
I think that's it sort of hits it right on the head that, this is clearly a democratic proclamation that he's making. It's about individualism, it's about equality, it's about treating people as equals, being an equal. It's not the king's sort of authoritarian rule. But the prince here is really the kind of ideal modern Asian leader that America would spend the entire 50s looking for, and sort of tragically in Vietnam. But he looks Asian, he is Asian, he's Siamese, but he embraces Western guidance of Anna, her teachings, he embraces Western political ideology, and he's young enough to lead Asia into the future. Right, so this
Mm-hmm.
is what Americans were looking for throughout Asia in the 50s,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's really interesting to. This is very characteristic of the 50s that the king and I express his liberal views on race, as does Michener, but there are limits to it, right? It doesn't abandon the idea of hierarchy. And I think that it casts America's relationship to Asia in kind of quasi-maternal terms, that Anna and the king and the children form a kind of a family, in which Anna is the intellectual and political mother to these children, and especially to the young Prince Chulalongkorn, that she teaches them about democracy and individualism, about the rule of law, about the sanctity of contract. And it's this idea of sort of having a maternal obligation. America has a maternal obligation to Asia. Um, the West has an obligation to help these Asians who are younger and weaker and less experienced in the ways of democracy. So Anna stays at the end of the film. They beg her to stay. Please don't leave us. Help us. We need your help. And she agrees to stay. So yes, it's very liberal in its views, but it's also Anna is still a kind of a guide.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the notion of yes, cultural exchange, but Anna is not profoundly transformed to her essence. But the entire country of Siam is transformed and will be transformed in the future. So again, there's cultural exchange, but it's not equal on both sides.
We have a very perceptive comment here from Michelle. The speech actually reminds me a bit of the Soviet propaganda image we saw earlier, with the crowd standing upright and with dignity. So I think we could say that Hollywood delivered our propaganda much better.
Yes, but you can see that, and this is what I think is interesting. The Soviets and the Americans are kind of competing with Asia and the third world as audience. Like, wait, we'll give you dignity. No, we'll respect you and we'll treat you with dignity. And they're in some ways they're selling similar stories,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the question is, well, who's gonna tilt in which direction, and who's got the more persuasive story?
Yeah, we had Yul Brenner and Deborah Carr, so I think we won.
Yeah, but again, remember, this is aimed towards Americans, right? This is
Yeah, well,
winning
that's
the
true.
minds of Americans, right?
That's right.
This is
That's
not,
right. It's
there's a whole
banned in
cultural cold,
Thailand.
exactly. There's a whole cultural Cold War in Asia, which I was going to talk about, but Richard said it was a little bit too off topic, so we can have that as another conversation.
Okay.
Um, but if we're ready to move on, is to take it in a different direction now, the conversation, and turn away from these two genres of popular culture and think about how the Cold War led to some shifts in the racial formation of Asian Americans. And I want to define that term because it might not be a familiar one. Um, but a racial formation refers to the historically specific and socially constructed racial categories within which people live their lives. And these are categories that are produced in a variety of ways. They're produced by social behaviors, by laws, and by the meanings that get attached to specific groups of people. And I think culture plays a very important role in racial formations because it's one of the most important means for the expression and circulation of ideas about a given group of people. Um, and the racial formation of Asians and Asian Americans before 1945 often categorized them as a yellow peril. There were restrictive immigration and naturalization laws that limited the entry of Asians into the US and kept them from becoming citizens. Social norms often ghettoized them in separate neighborhoods, and the media ascribed a host of negative meanings to them as a threat to white workers, I think, is what's implied in this cartoon. And during World War II, anti-Japanese propaganda continued this idea of yellow peril. Um, and I think this is a fabulous cartoon, and maybe we'll cut the question just for the sake of time. Um, but this cartoon, which is drawn by Dr. Seuss, if you see at the bottom, it really presents the Japanese as not loyal Americans, that they're loyal to Japan. Home is what they're called waiting for the signal from home, and home is what they're Japan is the home that they're looking at, not Washington or Oregon or California. And so Asians, in this case Japanese, they're foreigners. They're not real Americans. And they're a threat to the nation. They're being given blocks of TNT to explode. So this is really that sort of yellow peril racial formation gets a kind of a big boost in the war against Japan. But it's also in a contradictory way. World War II put some pressure on this yellow peril racial formation. The Chinese were allies, America's allies in the war. So Washington had to start loosening up its anti-Chinese immigration law, and in 1943 repeals the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the Cold War puts even more pressure on the yellow peril racial formation, because how can Americans claim to be the leader of free Asia if they won't even let Asians into America, right? That's a real powerful contradiction. So the legal regulation of Asian Americans starts to change over the course of the late 40s and early 1950s. And the US, begins to open its doors to Asian immigration and naturalization, as in the War Brides Act of 1945. And I think this is a great image of these two couples. But one place where we can see this changing racial formation of Asian Americans is in the magazine coverage of the debates over Hawaii's campaign for statehood. Hawaii had been a U.S. territory since 1898, and between 1945 and 1959, its leaders waged an ongoing campaign for statehood. And the territory's leaders wanted Hawaii to be fully incorporated into the U.S. with all the rights and benefits that accrued with that. But they encountered some serious opposition from some people on the mainland to becoming a state. And so here's a question: where do you think that opposition to Hawaii's statehood came from? Who do you think on the mainland was against Hawaii's statehood, and why?
Okay. Who do you think was against Hawaii's statehood and why? Some people to this day do not believe Hawaii is a state, but nonetheless, pineapple companies say the opposition was from a mixture of distance and racism due to its large non-Euro American population. Merrill notes Southern senators. I wonder why.
All
Did we
right,
get did we get that one right, Tina?
you guys are good. These are great answers. Absolutely. So race was really the key issue. Hawaii had a majority non-white population. 54% of the population was Asian, only 30% was Caucasian. Hawaii didn't have legal segregation. All the races lived together, and intermarriage was quite common. So on the mainland, there was some resistance to admitting all these Asian people as full Americans, in part this sort of lingering, continuing yellow peril. This idea of Asians as a foreign threat certainly doesn't exist. It still exists today. You can find it. But the strongest opposition really did come from Southern senators who wanted to preserve legal segregation between black and white in the South. And they saw Hawaii as a challenge to Jim Crow. because it showed that colored people and white people could live together with relative ease. And they also feared that Hawaii would send Asian representatives to Congress and that they would vote in favor of civil rights legislation. So the Hawaii statehood is really caught up with Southern politics and the politics of segregation and Jim Crow. But let's turn to the media. Um, and the media coverage of the Hawaii statehood debate is interesting because it showed how the Cold War was starting to change some of the meanings, not all of the meanings, but some of the meanings that were being attached to Asian Americans. And the Cold War made it easier for some Asians to be seen as real Americans rather than as a threat to America. And starting in 1945, advocates for Hawaii statehood wrote lots of articles, magazine and newspaper articles promoting statehood. James Michener wrote quite a few of them. His novel Hawaii, if any of you have ever read it, is really a 500-page polemic in favor of statehood. But these photographs were published as part of an article that was published in Life magazine in 1945. And I invite you to interpret these images and to think about what kind of meanings these photographs are ascribing to the Asian American and Pacific American population of Hawaii.
Okay. What kind of meaning do these images ascribe to the Asian American and Pacific American population of Hawaii?
And
Any
yes,
takers on that?
images, sorry to overtalk, the women on the right are all of mixed heritage. And you can't quite read the text underneath it, but they're all the various mixtures of all the different populations in Hawaii.
Karen writes, I noticed they show only women, less threatening than men. Jason writes, a new race. Are the women on the right of mixed heritage? Yes, they are. Women and kids. We have two kids there on the left playing together. A new beginning. Yes, certainly on the left-handed image there. And I think it is significant. These are all women. These are the people who are going to bear this new mixed racial population. They're the ones who are going to give birth to this. Let's see, what else do we have? Definitely non-threatening. They won't be in Congress. Well, in 1959, that's true. They also show that American women are beautiful, just as Asian women are beautiful, just as Caucasian women are. And some of the women, of course, look, very Caucasian. The one there in the middle, the upper column, we don't know what color her hair is, but she could be Irish, an appeal that employs stereotypes of beauty. While these are mixed race women, they can dress and style their hair in traditional Caucasian ways. So I think we read that image pretty well, Tina. What do you think?
I think absolutely. And I think this idea of a melting pot, that Hawaii proves that Americans aren't inherently racist. It proves that people of color and white people can get along together. This picture of that friendship between these two girls. But there's also, I think, gender is clearly important here. And it suggests these exotic, beautiful women are maybe a resource for the nation if they were to be accepted into the part of the country, and that the metaphor, an implied metaphor of sexual union or marriage in which a masculine mainland is joined with a feminine Hawaii. So I think this sort of it's not a racial hierarchy, but it's a kind of a gender hierarchy is a little bit suggested here. So again, always the sort of the liberal views on race, and then always the limits of that as well. How far can it go? I want to turn to another article. This one is from Business Week in 1915. It's titled Hawaii, a Bridge to Asia. And it presents more of a geopolitical argument in favor of statehood. And here it says, the islands have brought to the U.S. a new national resource, a population that is the logical stepping stone between the U.S. and the Orient. There are now thousands of citizens of Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Filipino ancestry who understand the customs and in some cases speak the language of the country of their fathers and grandfathers, yet are still firmly American. America has always had cultural ties with Europe. Now the Hawaiians are asking what more logical intermediaries to carry an understanding of U.S. democracy to the Orient. And I think this is interesting. This is, not using the language of gender. This is a magazine aimed at businessmen. So what kind of meanings are being ascribed to Asian Americans here? They're kind of different from the ones in Life magazine. So how do we interpret this?
Okay, what kind of meanings are being ascribed to Asian Americans here in Hawaii? Aimed at businessmen. Let's see, we've got some folks typing in. This was, of course, 1950. All right. They would be useful tools for cultural exchange that leads to business opportunities. Ambassadors of democracy and commerce. Let's see. Yeah, this is 1950. This is, of course, before the Asian economies. Certainly, Japan was beginning to come back from World War II. Chinese economy was still not very vigorous. Seems like the fulfillment of the integration idea of the State Department, capitalism's missionaries. Yeah, Hawaii is this halfway point between the United States and Asia. Wants to be part of both worlds, open the opportunities to the possibility of business in Asia, but especially the historically closed economy of China, appealing to the strategic, strong businessman logic as a national resource, palatable couriers of American culture and capitalism. Tina, what do you make of these responses?
I think these are very good. I think that there's what you see is this notion of a resource that Asian Americans have had this movement in their meaning, this shift in meaning from threat to resource, that they're a new national resource. And you know, I think there is very clearly the economic dimension here. Asia has raw materials that the U.S. is very eager to maintain access to. So that sense there is an implied access. Ah, we can have these sort of emissaries, capitalist emissaries, as it were. But also, as somebody says, what was it? You know, missionaries for democracy and capitalism. As sort of we can, it will be Asian Americans who can carry America's values and stories and sort of political ideals into Asia better, perhaps, than white people. Um, and I think that this is where the idea of integration becomes um, double-sided because you can see how the need to integrate the non-communist countries of Asia into the free world created pressure to integrate Asian Americans into the mainstream American culture. That you can see how this notion of integration works both ways, and again, how foreign policy and domestic policy are really connected. And this comes back to Rodgers and Hammerstein, right? They did three musicals. Two of them are about, one's about the Pacific, one's about Asia, and one's about Asian Americans, and very much about Asian Americans as regular, ordinary Americans. So you can see in those musicals that same linkage of Asia and Asian Americans, Cold War integration, and domestic racial integration.
Mhm.
Um,
If I may just interject here from it, Rashida Smith makes a very interesting comment here. The American dream is transferable through Asian Americans willing to carry American ideals and business back to Asia. So I
yeah, I
think.
mean, think about Gary. You know, Gary Locke was the you know, what was he, was he the ambassador or the to China? So I mean, we can see that even today that there's political value
Mhm.
in Asian Americans if you want to do business or to conduct politics. And I
Mhm.
also think that there's a whole Barack Obama angle to Hawaii. Michener wrote in Hawaii, in the novel Hawaii, that Hawaii is so important because it's this place of racial mixing, and we're going to get away from these hard and fast racial boundaries. And he has this whole vision of the golden man. And Michener's thinking about Asia, like sort of a mix of Asian and Pacific and American. But I don't think it's really a coincidence or an accident that it's Barack Obama who comes out of Hawaii, who is this model of, you know, racial mixture and a kind of a global world spanning family history that's Africa, that's Asia, that's America. And this idea of being post-racial. You know, Michener is talking about that in 1959, and he doesn't quite see it as African American, but he does see it as this sort of post-racial. Hawaii has the possibility of a post-racial American future. So I think it's quite interesting that Obama comes from Hawaii.
Mhm. Well, shall we move ahead?
Sure, you know, we're basically I'm down to my last slide.
Well, let's
So
hit
here
that last one.
a great cover from Life magazine, America's World Abroad, millions of ambassadors over the earth. And this is a U.S. information officer with monks in Laos. To wrap up, I just want to come back to one of my opening questions, which is how does paying attention to works of culture help us to understand the Cold War more fully? How does it allow us to see certain aspects of the Cold War that we might not have seen before? Um, I think part of it is if we look at popular culture, middlebrow culture, we can see just how important Asia was to the US in the 40s and 50s, which we might not fully recognize. Um, I think we can see how middlebrow culture does that work of selling the Cold War and selling internationalism, not just as a sort of a conspiracy and not just as doing the government's bidding, but because there were a lot of people, producers of culture and popular intellectuals, who really believed that this was important and that culture is the place where you educate Americans about the world. I think that that impulse is still with us today. I think to recognize the extent to which political ideals of the Cold War circulated throughout popular culture and through certain genres in particular, the musical and the travel writing were particularly adept at carrying Cold War ideology, but that it was widely dispersed throughout the cultural realm. And ultimately, I think it helps to help us to see that the worlds of foreign policy and the worlds of culture um, are not totally separate in American life, that they really work together during the 50s to create a certain vision of the world and to create a certain vision of America's role in that world. And to be able to see those connections, I think is really important because I think those connections continue. That culture and politics are not totally separate and divorced from each other, um, and that we can learn to think about them, to read them in relation to one another.
I think you're absolutely right, and our participants follow your comments. Meredith Murphy writes, this Life magazine cover illustrates the same concept as the Peace Corps, representing America at its best in the battle for influence. And of course, the Cold War was very much a battle for influence in what we now, or what we used to call the Third World. I don't think propaganda. I don't think it's all propaganda intentionally. I think some of it is very hopeful. Got a lot of last comments here. They certainly illuminate the integration side to the Cold War. Thank you. I had not connected intercultural and global education historically back to the Cold War. Pop culture speaks to a more universal American experience of the Cold War and the events of American history in general. Peace Corps in the 60s, a natural extension of the cultural integration of the 50s. And ladies and gentlemen, I think you've gotten your last comments in here beautifully. Tina, I want to thank you very much for this webinar. I've learned a great deal. And of course, you realize that you have planted the song Getting to Know You on a perpetual loop in my head.
Yes,
and I will.
and that's so important because that's why musicals are so political, right? Because it's once it's in your head, you can never get it out of your head, and that's why musicals are such a political, sort of powerful genre. Um, you'll all be singing "Getting to Know You" for a few weeks now.
Yes, and I will never hear that song the same way again. And I want to thank our participants for their active participation. As I mentioned, our cardinal rule is the more you participate, the better the webinar. And folks, you participated beautifully, and I think this has been one of our best webinars. So thank you very much. And again, thank you, Tina.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to all the teachers. I have a daughter in high school, so high school history teachers are awesome. Thank you very much for giving me your attention.
Okay, and now, ladies and gentlemen, please join us next week on March 10th at 7 o'clock for our next webinar, The 1960s in American Memory. Was it all sex, drugs, and rock and roll? And then please go back to the website for this evening and fill out that evaluation and get it to us. And once you've done that, you will be able to download your document of participation. So I hope we see you again next week, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your participation this evening, and good night.